When I was a little kid, my family lived in Tampa, Florida, and my extended family lived in Metro Atlanta. And every few months, we would pile into my mom's small, beat up, unair conditioned little old car and make the 8-hour drive straight up I 75 to see our grandparents in Marietta. Now, usually when we left, my sister and I were really excited about this. We were excited to go see our grandmother and papa. We were excited to see our cousins. We were excited because it was Christmas. But then somewhere around the Georgia-Florida border, usually, we would start getting tired of being in that car. We would be hungry, or we'd be uncomfortable, or whoever was in the back seat, usually me, was tired of being in the back seat. Usually by the time we started to get bored, my mom was pulling out the emergency reinforcements, and she was a champ at traveling with 2 kids. She would pack us little boxes of crayons and coloring sheets and little games we could play by ourselves, like a Rubik's Cube. And she knew all these word games and songs that we would sing just to keep us occupied. But despite her best efforts, sometimes my sister and I would still grumble and fight with each other. And usually by the time we arrived in Marietta, we were all ready to be out of that car. Now, this is probably a familiar story to many of you, especially if you've ever traveled with little kids. Traveling is hard. And usually those of us who say that we like to travel, people like me, I like to travel. What we really mean is that we like being someplace different. We don't like the process of getting there. We don't like being stuck in a car. We don't like going through TSA and getting on a plane where the seats somehow always seem to get smaller and your elbows and shoulders are bumping up against a stranger. And until pretty recently in human history, traveling was not only uncomfortable, it was also dangerous, and it took a really long time. We can kind of understand why so many authors use travel as a metaphor for change, as a signifier of this transformation or discovery. Because a journey or traveling is a time between certainties. It's a time between where we start and where we mean to end up. And so whether our travel is literal or it's metaphorical, when we are traveling, we are in a time of transition. And that's really what's going on with the Israelites when we meet them in chapter 16 of Exodus this week. They have left Egypt. They are free of Pharaoh. They have followed Moses faithfully into the wilderness. They're not sure where they're meant to be going, but there is some kind of promise that it's going to be great when they get there. But now that they're actually on the journey, now that they're actually traveling, they're starting to get bored. And they're definitely hangry in this passage. They're in this transition between the time of bondage, the time of slavery in Egypt, and the promise of inhabiting a promised land that God has told them about. They've experienced the liberation of coming out from Egypt, but they're now in the time of now what? When we find ourselves in these times of now what, these times where we've come out of something hard or we've been part of a movement for liberation, we don't just end up in the promised land immediately. There's a time of travel. There's a time of journey. There's a time of wandering in the wilderness. And it's when we're in those times of wandering in the wilderness that we start to encounter and be challenged by some deeper parts of liberation that are beyond just being set free from Pharaoh. So there's 2 things that I want us to look at today as part of this process, this journey of liberation that the Israelites are on. Now, the first one is kind of the obvious one. It's that the people have a physical need because they are now in the wilderness. They're no longer living in Egypt. They no longer have their meals somewhat guaranteed. There's no longer an economy that they're a part of where they can find food. They're not sitting around the fire and the flesh pots of Egypt anymore. And now they're hungry. They have a real need to be fed, to be cared for, to be provided for. And so they start, the passage says, start to grumble or start to mumble or start to murmur. And as they do this, they start to yearn for a time when they could be guaranteed of their next meal, the time when they were back in Egypt. But Yahweh hears their mumbling, hears their prayers, hears their complaints, and provides meat at night and manna in the morning. And what a miracle this is, because somehow through no action of their own, the Israelites have enough. Every person is satisfied. Every need is met. There's no more want. There's no more starving. There's provision. And so what I think we need to hear from this is that the very real physical needs of people are part of liberation. God has a vision and a desire for people to be provided for. I believe that God sets up our world to provide for us. God does not desire hunger. God does not desire poverty. And all of those things are a form of oppression, a form of bondage that people need to be set free from. Our bodies need caring for too. God cares about what happens to our physical selves. And we as people who believe that we are co-workers in God's liberating work, can't forget about those real human physical needs. We can't only be about spiritual well-being, we have to be about physical well-being too. We have to establish a community, establish a society, establish a way of being together where people's immediate physical needs are met. Because that is God's desire too. Because poverty interferes with human thriving. And because if we want people to be free, then their bodies need to be free too. You probably know that part already. You maybe have heard that interpretation of this scripture before. But I want to dig a little bit deeper into this passage. Now, some commentators, some scholars read this passage and they ask the question, what happened to all the livestock they brought with them into the wilderness? The Israelites have only been wandering in the wilderness, have only been out of Egypt for a month. And according to just a few passages before, when they left, they took herds of livestock with them, sheep and cattle. Why, if they have all of this livestock, are they now complaining that they're hungry? Well, in this society, in this type of community, livestock is property. Livestock is wealth. Livestock puts you at a higher or a lower position comparatively to the other people that are part of your community. So we can assume that this livestock didn't get all eaten up, but somehow people are not willing to share. The folks who are leading those herds, who own them, don't want to lose their investment. They know that the promised land is coming and they're going to get in position for that new day. Those folks need a message of liberation too. And it's not a liberation from physical need, physical hunger. It's a liberation from greed. It's a liberation from fear. When these folks who have perhaps been able to position themselves as the highest up in this wandering band of Hebrew people, when they experience the manna from heaven and the quails in the evening, God's provision that is just enough but not anymore, That's a sense of loss for them. That's not a joyous provision. That's suddenly not as much as they maybe are used to. And we see in this passage that people try to hoard it. People try to collect more manna than just what they need for that day. And God has set up the system to where if you try to hoard more than you need, worms eat it up. And it begins to smell, it becomes rancid, and it's foul and no longer worth anything. And so in this exact same story where God is meeting the need of people who are truly hungry, God is also confounding the greed of those who would hoard this blessed gift, this example of God's provision. And so when we think about the way God is leading people into a new community, we have to understand that part of that liberation is a liberation from the sins of our past. Part of it is a liberation from the positions of privilege and wealth that we maybe have inhabited before. Friends, greed is a form of fear. Greed is a form of a lack of faith. Greed means that we are no longer caring for the community above all else. We're worried about ourselves. We don't fully believe that God is going to care for us. And when we fall into that sin and that trap of greed, when we hoard more than we need, when we think of ourselves above the needs of those who are hungry next door, not only does it destroy the community, not only does it destroy this balance that God has established to where there is enough, it also destroys us because it separates us from the joy of God's provision. It separates us from the wonder of God's creation. It separates us from the provision and love of God. And it centers us instead on our own weakness, on our own fear. It's in between times when we've left the bad place and are on the way to the promised land. It's in these transitions of wilderness and wandering that the truly hard work of liberation is done. The hard work of deciding if our communities are really going to be free enough to where there is enough, or if they're only going to be a replication of what we had before. When the immediate external threat of Pharaoh is gone, then what? What community do we want to form? What promised land do we want to inhabit? Are we really willing to seek liberation, not just from Pharaoh, but from things like poverty and greed and self-centeredness and fear? Are we willing to get so free that we can walk away from those things too? I think this work is hard, if not harder, than leaving Egypt. Because it asks good people, allies, if you will, to sacrifice the things that we think are keeping us safe and secure, and instead truly invest our trust in the community that God is building for us.